But first of all, I wanted to thank the organizers. This has been just such an amazing, like everybody has said, it's been just incredible. And I really appreciate the invitation. This is just, and getting to know everybody, including people who are backstage working hard and also the graduate students who have been great. Um, so, um, so what Peter mentioned is like almost like he gave me the scaffolding for what I'm gonna say. So it's gonna be really, I think it's gonna be very useful to go right after. Um, so I wanted to show these two images. One of them, an art, a photo, or a picture. Sorry, from 1834 through 39, and the other one, 2016, when I was doing my research in Ipanema, in Rio de Janeiro, and I was also doing research in another neighborhood that is a very elite, wealthy neighborhood in Puerto Rico called El Condado. And for a long time, just to understand how I got there, how I got to the research on white elites in Latin America, I wanted to explain that for most of my academic trajectory, I had actually focused on probably the right side of those pictures, beginning with the domestic workers and towards the nannies. I started working in Latinx communities in the US, first in Chicago among Puerto Ricans. And my first question was always, why is nationalism a bad word in the US? Because I had come from Puerto Rico where nationalism is just like positive all through. And then, I started reading different colleagues and how, the distinctions between imperial nationalism or colonial nationalism and anti-colonial nationalism and all these distinctions. That was very helpful. Then I moved and started working among Puerto Ricans and Brazilian immigrants in Newark, New Jersey, which is a predominantly African American city, and noticed that Blackness was actually a very positive attribute. It was very cosmopolitan. It was very much used in contrast to the off-the-boat migrants. So the Mexican kids with the shiny shoes were the backwards kids, whereas the Black kids and Black Puerto Rican kids were the cool kids because they wore certain things or spoke in a certain way or had a certain affect that was not about being happy and say good morning, but like they were tough, and that was like a good thing. So all of these things actually got me to thinking about what is going on the other end or on the other side of what I'm noticing here. Who is benefiting from all these different ways in which affect has been shifting a long time, in which the idea of Blackness is not as simple as just to say, it's always associated with oppression versus not. So how do we get all of this understood from the people who actually benefit from those from those understandings of difference and subordination? So that's when I started working more in the white upper class Latin Americans, and this is the ethnography that came out of it. It's called Parenting Empires, and it really was very much inspired by this idea that the market is shaped and reshaped by moral struggles, even though those struggles do not always provoke resistance or the pursuit of equality. But what is operating behind ideas of empire in an everyday life? So I did an ethnography that to use not a comparison between neighborhoods, but more a similar understanding of like what is these ideas of parenting that we're seeing emerging. At the time, I had also become a parent, and what nobody tells you is that the hardest thing of parenting is dealing with other parents, and I don't know if that's global, but then I realized that it was. And it's like, I don't want to be friends with any of these people, and yet I have to relate to them. But it's not always been like that, right? I mean, so what is it about this parenting thing that prevents adult solidarity, that creates different kinds of priorities that and so I did this ethnographic work among parents, very wealthy parents in two very prominent areas of Latin America, very high class or upscale areas of Latin America. And parenting in this case was the lens that I used to examine other liberal democratic concepts. So it was not only about parents. In fact, it was not only about kids at all. It was not about kids. Like parenting was completely divorced from having children. It was an identity that people perform for other adults. And what did this say about sovereignty, empire, corruption, and how did these ideas get recast in everyday life? Um, and what did it say about hierarchies of class and race in these spaces? When I told people that I was going to study wealthy, oh, sorry, how do I do back? When I told people that I was going to study wealthy people, wealthy parents in Latin America, my husband was the first one to say, "Oh my God, that's going to be fun for you! Like to listen to all these crazy, like uptight, awful, snobbish people." And of course, what you find when you study wealthy white people is that they're perfectly pleasant, super nice. They talk about race all the time. They don't, this idea that in Latin America people are, no, they talk about how evil racism is. They talk about how other Latin Americans don't acknowledge that there is racism. They talk about how they want their children to learn to talk about racism, how they want their children to meet other children who are different, how they so basically the discussion of racism and this aspect of racial knowledge becomes the way in which they claim access to a broader, beyond Puerto Rico, beyond Brazil type of empire connections. So that to me was very surprising because here I am thinking, this is what I'm going to find. And then I'm finding this. There's definitely not a lack of knowledge. The vocabulary is super sophisticated. Um, and and one of the things that also began sort of was really influential in terms of my thinking, and this is what I've been struggling with, is people are invested in being good people. There is an investment in a moral economy of being a good person among the wealthy. Nobody wants their children to be spoiled brats. Nobody, like, I mean, I've had literally like wealthy parents who say, "I will tell the maid not to go pick up the kid who left the socks on the floor," that kind of stuff, because I want them to be independent. They have all these different kinds of, it's over the board. And so if you have all these people who really believe this and think this way, how come we still have some of the same situations and divisions and inequalities as we've always had, if not more? And that has been what I've been struggling with ever since I've been working on these projects, but also specifically when I started flipping the lens to these white wealthy people in Latin America. One of the things that emerged from this project as something that was very particular, or not particular, but like very also interesting, was that a lot of the people that I interviewed were very dependent on self-growth. There was a lot of therapeutic cultural language that emerged as part of their search for equality. So many of them were talking about how they would discuss with the nanny that had raised their children, how they would try to get them to talk about their relationships, how divorced mothers would talk to nannies about their own failed relationships, how they viewed these women as interlocutors, and they really felt sincere. And they felt sincere and I interview people for this part. I did interview some nannies, but the focus really was on the parents, and I just want to say that out there because I felt that there was so much about nannies in Latin America and domestic workers in Latin America, which also led me to think, it's like we know so much about certain groups and then we protect others and never study others. And that was also very informative. But anyway, so what I got from here, from this particular work, was that idea of creating a sense of a good person. And even with all this attempt to create a good person, they were still very falling short. But how did these people create a good person? So it turns out that a lot of people were talking to me about their therapists. So whether there was a life coach or whether it was the psychologist or the psychoanalyst. And one of the things that I realized, one of the things, we're moving fast. One of the things that I realized is the role that therapy has played in this idea of being a good person. Like almost if you know the language of therapy, like you are already automatically a good person. So a lot of these white people are, and I know that there have been a lot of discussion about psychoanalysis in South America. Most people attribute it to Argentina, and Brazilians assure me that that's very 70s, a very 70s way of thinking about it. Really is Brazil, who's like the mecca of psychoanalysis right now. And so I thought, okay, great. I'll just do more stuff in Rio, which I know already. It's like, no, you have to go to Sao Paulo. That's where the psychoanalysts of the very wealthy are. To make a long story short, I ended up, and I don't know how, I've never been so close to like I'm talking like bankers that everybody's would know their name. Like I haven't go. I actually met the psychoanalyst of some of these people, which totally like amazes me. Um, the Yale thing goes a long way. That's another thing. I mean, with parenting also, it's like, oh yeah, I go to Yale. Like, oh my God, maybe you can get my kid into Yale, so I'll talk to you everything you want. Is that kind of that's totally take advantage of whatever you can, right? But anyways, so I got interviews, a handful of psychoanalysts, and they are very much in trying to make sense also of who these wealthy white people are. But one of the things, and many things came out of this, and I'm still processing a lot of it, and it's just a very tentative title that I'm calling this. But and we don't have too much time. But what I'm gonna say is that one of the things that psychoanalysts, all of them, assure me is that a lot of the discussions in the psychoanalysis have to do with these wealthy people's relationships to affective subordinates, which is the term that I'm using to call nannies, domestic workers, chauffeurs, anybody who's paid but who has a subordinate position, many of them racialized population, not all of them, but many of them. And so how did these so because psychoanalysis, as you may know, and these Freudian and Lacanian mostly, they do have throw from other like Melanie Klein and other people, but mostly, as you know, like psychoanalysis, you have to take like different kinds of intake interviews, talk about childhood, and a lot of times what this psychoanalysis, among the many things that this psychoanalysis do, is create a notion of the vulnerable wealthy and the affective subordinate. The vulnerable wealthy meaning all these people had parents that were inadequate, that they came from dysfunctional families, nobody knew how to express affection, nobody had the therapeutic vocabulary to really be warm, and except for the nanny, except for the domestic worker, except for the chauffeur. All of those people in this particular context were considered to be savvy. They were emotionally intelligent, poor people, basically. It's like it was the nanny who gave this affection. It was the chauffeur who talked to the boy about sex. It was, and so these psychoanalysts offer a kind of what I'm calling psychological liquidity, and I'm using it just like as financial liquidity, but like I'm not gonna go into the details of what it is, but in any event, so I guess my question is, and I'm just putting it out there, and I'm not, um, do we gain anything from noticing instances in which there is an appearance of of a flip in the power structure? Is obviously not a flip in the power structure. It's a very momentarily thing. It's a very just furtive, just like very instant. It's very much more about just about. Let me see if I should have another. Oh, I do. Okay. It's do we considering is there a possibility? Is there any advantage to think about how study of power can benefit from things that are very senseless? Because it's very senseless to think that any of these super powerful people, even for one moment, will lose power from doing anything. They don't. But there are these particular moments in which they also have a certain vulnerability. And I think that in terms of actionable things, I think building and touching on that and what is that about gives us an opening of like there's something, because I always feel like if we keep the subordinates subordinate and the oppressors, it feels like there's nothing we can do. So is there anything? Time is up. So and I'm not gonna go, but and I was gonna take, and this is also building a little bit on the idea of the racism of intimacy, right? That we know that precisely because we allow these interactions between whites and non-whites, or poor and wealthy, sometimes sometimes all of this is accompanied by affection, and affection really creates these very complicated ways of understanding power. And can we come up with different ways of looking at this? And I'm just like putting it out there, and it's like, anyways. So we're going to lunch. So thank you.